Hello, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. Today we have with us Philip Ball, a UK-based science writer who has spent many years working at the prestigious science magazine Nature and has since gone on to write a whole bunch of fascinating books, including books on chemistry, quantum mechanics, sound theory, and lately, alchemy. Totally fascinating conversation about all the things we know, thought we knew, definitely don't know via science.
This episode of On the Line is brought to you by Universities Canada. From cancer treatments and clean water technologies to quantum computing and AI, university research is driving discoveries that change lives. These breakthroughs start in Canadian university labs, but their impact is felt in every community. Universities carry out nearly 40% of Canada's research and development, generating more than $55 billion in economic impact every year. Every dollar invested returns benefits for Canadians, new treatments, new industries, and thriving communities. But research requires sustained federal support. Without it, Canada risks losing talent and ideas abroad. To learn more, visit Univcan.ca.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. Today we have with us Philip Ball. Philip Ball is a kind of popular science writer, fairly well known in the UK, and I just happened upon his bibliography and saw that he had a bunch of fascinating titles on everything from the beauty of chemistry to the nature of music to I think his latest title, which actually gets into alchemy of all things. And I thought, hey, I'm willing to bet that Philip Ball and I would have a hell of a time if he came on and had a chat with me. So thank you very much for taking such time, Mr. Ball. I really do appreciate it. But firstly, before we get in, I just wanted you to introduce yourself a little bit because I don't think many of our audience will necessarily know about your work, although you've been extraordinarily prolific on a really interesting range of fields. So firstly, I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into science, and how you got into science writing?
Well, I trained as a scientist. My first degree was in chemistry, and then I moved to study physics for my PhD. But I'd always been interested in writing, and it had never occurred to me that you could actually combine those two things until I came to the end of my PhD, and I found, unlike a lot of PhD students, I actually found that I enjoyed writing up the work that I'd done. And so I figured, maybe there was some way of making a living doing this. And I, at that time, I was incredibly lucky that an opportunity opened up at the science journal Nature, which is one of the oldest and one of the most prestigious science journals in the world. And so it was a fantastic place to be. So I got that job, and because I happened to be at the right shape to fill the slot that came up. And I stayed there for the best part of 2 decades, really, in one way or another. And it was an amazing place to be. I started working there in the late 1980s, and it's a place where most of, one might say, the most exciting, most groundbreaking scientific work was being submitted and was being published. So it was a fantastic sort of training ground for finding out what was going on in science more broadly. But I did want to do more writing, and gradually I sort of went part-time, and then now I'm a full-time freelance writer. And that meant that I could, particularly in terms of writing books, it meant that I could write about whatever took my fancy. And so that has it stayed within science, but it's meandered for sure, because I'm also very interested in, I'd say, the history of ideas, the history of why we think the things we do today and how people used to think differently, and how that progression happened over the centuries, really. So some of that writing is about the history of science, but I'm particularly interested in the ways in which scientific ideas have interacted with the broader culture. And that might mean anything from, for example, I wrote a book about the history of colours, how new colours were invented over time, because they really were invented. There was a time when painters didn't have all the colours they have today.
My husband still insists that most of the colors that I see are completely invented fantasies. So
it's in a sense, all colour is invented in our minds. sort of objective thing in the world that corresponds to red. It's just a particular sort of frequency of light. It's our brain that interprets them in those ways, and in ways we don't actually fully understand. But when painters use colored materials, they have to get them from somewhere. And so the invention of new pigments over time meant that painters could literally show people colors they had never seen before. And that sort of transformed the way painters thought about and used color in art. So, that's just one example of ways in which science and technology, being done sometimes for its own sake, fed into culture in ways that we are just invisible now. When we go to an art gallery, we don't necessarily think what these materials actually are, but the people who made those paintings, particularly in the past, when you couldn't just go into a paint shop and get them off the shelf, had to think very hard about where they were going to get their materials from and what they were made from. So my book writing has been interested in these kinds of interactions between science and art and history and ideas and literature and music, as you say. And it's often a very rich way of talking about science without explicitly doing so, without people necessarily realizing that what you're talking about is science. If you write a book about, the history of color in art, people aren't going to expect it to be a science book, but actually there is a lot of science in that subject.
Well, so first I would just like to say, as a journalist, I'm deeply horrified that anyone would take an actual honest-to-God hard sciences degree and use it to do journalism and writing, because I tend to think that people who actually have the intelligence and discipline to do the degree that I could never in a million years accomplish should probably should have some kind of obligation to cure cancer or something. But I'm both horrified and delighted that you've joined us on this side of the writing line. This is wonderful for humanity, I think. Can you talk to me about how you sort of made that transition from writing or doing work for a publication like Nature, which is a phenomenal publication, but not really a popular publication? I think most people who are reading Nature themselves have pretty high science degrees, or operating in those fields, and then decided to make the jump into really popular writing. And what drove that transition for you? And can you give us a couple of examples of some of your favorite books that you've written?
Okay, of mine. That's always nice to do.
I know this would be the bad time to be like I'm really into Shakespeare. No, that wasn't exactly the question I was going for.
Well, it was all of this was a matter of learning on the job. These days, someone who wants to make that transition from studying science to writing about it, there are all kinds of science journalism, science communication courses that people can take, many of which are, extremely good. And a lot of people who come into the business now have taken those courses. When I started, there was nothing like that. And so it was all about learning on the job, learning the hard way, really, just making the same mistake over and over again until you finally realized it was best to do things another way. And I guess I feel that partly the reason I do this is that it's just a fantastic privilege as a freelance writer now to be able to think, that's an interesting thing. I'd like to spend a couple of years digging into that, whatever it is. But also, it really does feel to me as though increasingly there's an obligation on the part of science, on the part of the science community generally, to try to communicate what they're doing to the general public, because sciences of all sorts, but perhaps particularly in biomedicine, are hugely impinging on our lives. And for scientists at the workbench, it's very hard for them to find the time and to have the skills, the practice to be able, and the language to be able to do that. So I think the role of someone who is a science communicator is one that we need desperately. But I felt increasingly also, excuse me. I felt increasingly also, and I think the COVID pandemic really sort of brought this home, that we need more than just translators who can explain in everyday terms what the scientists are doing. We need people who are commentators, who are, if you like, science critics in the same way as we have theatre critics and literary critics, to provide context and sometimes to literally criticize what science is doing. So that's really the role that, as a journalist, I'm striving to fill very often, to act as both a communicator but also as a commentator, to provide that kind of context and criticism to help people weigh up, how to make sense of the headlines they see. I mean, I've literally, just before this call, I was writing a piece about there was this new announcement from NASA that they might have signs of life on Mars, which would be a huge deal if we actually found such a thing. And as sort of tends to be the case here, what they've actually got is a possible sign that might be interpreted as a sign of ancient life that once existed on Mars, and nothing more than that. And I think it's very important for announcements like that people know that that's really what we're looking at. It's not the discovery of life on another planet. So there needs to be that context brought to the science reporting.
There's an interesting, I just came out of having a very interesting experience, which I myself am about to write about, which I think tried to blend the experience of essentially spirituality from a scientific point of view, or to use science or a science-informed approach to spirituality to sort of generate experiences for people. And I'm not going to get into that because read the line to go read that when that one comes out. But one thing that I really took away from it was, if not a concern, an observation that the use of science to a lot of what was being done was a reskinning of spirituality and mystical experience around scientific language and scientific processes, or the appearance of scientific processes. And I walked away from that kind of a little bit concerned. Not that my experience was poor, it wasn't, but concerned because I think that the human quest for meaning is basically universal, and people are looking for answers, experiential knowledge to give them some reassurance about what in the world we are and what we're doing here. And when you take away the word God and you replace it with the word consciousness, and when you take away sort of more esoteric terminology or ideas and you replace them with something a little bit more scientific sounding, my concern is that we're now putting religious dogma into a scientific framework, but because it's in a scientific framework, it becomes immune to criticism and critique. It becomes immune to debate. It's if somebody's talking about the Bible and what the Bible means, there can be a debate about that because everybody understands that is a religious framework that's open to different interpretations. But if you're having this is the science shows us this, and I think that problem is made all the worse when you have people who don't necessarily have the firmest grasp on the limits of science and what science actually is, right? So I don't know if that's an idea that interests you, but it popped up in my head as we were speaking.
It does very much, and I absolutely agree that I think there are times when the authority of science and the apparent certainty that science sometimes is able to offer can be misapplied and even misused to give authority to something that doesn't really have it, and also that it can tend to lead us to try to use scientific tools to answer questions that science isn't really equipped to do. Right. I think some of the questions that are asked in religious traditions are probably of that nature. But I mean, for me, I found that was the case when I was writing about music. Which I wanted to do because in my other life, I'm a musician. In my fantasy life, I would have once been a musician. And I was interested in that intersection of science and music, and in particular, the book was about how our brains make sense of music, the cognition of music, as it's called. And it's a fascinating area, and we can say a lot about how our brains do this incredible task of taking this really, really complex acoustic signal and turning it into something that not only we can understand, and we can say, oh, there's the violins and there's, the brass and so on, but also that moves us. And we can say some things from scientific studies about how that is and why that is. But I found, in looking into this deeply, that it can only go so far. That actually there's something that the people talk about it as being ineffable in music, and I kind of do feel that. I don't think that these scientific studies are ever going to somehow fully crack and explain why music does what it does. That isn't to say that there's anything kind of, paranormal or mystical about that, but I think that scientific processes and scientific thinking is only equipped to take us so far in exploring questions like that, questions about human experience. So I totally agree that we have to recognize the limits of what science can tell us about.
Do you think that we will ever get to a point with science where we can bridge the gap of the numinous, where we can fully explain things that are mysterious and ineffable to us now? Or does the framework of science that we're operating within make that last mile basically impossible?
Well, I guess all I can say is that I don't see it happening at the moment. I don't see any prospect of bridging that gap. I guess one of the areas in which that might apply is to understand what we mean by consciousness. And neuroscientists are really struggling with this problem, in part because we don't really even know quite what the question is. We have the experience of being conscious, of being aware, but we don't know how to express that in scientific terms. So we don't, when we have all this machinery for looking inside the brain and measuring it in incredible detail and seeing what individual neurons are doing and so on. But when we're talking about consciousness, we don't know what we're looking for exactly. So that may come. There may be some revelation someday that makes it clear what we mean by that, but it's by no means clear that that's going to happen at the moment. And yet that is one of the most profound questions in the whole of science, in the whole of physical science, really, how it can be that bits of the universe, that collections of atoms, as we are able to become aware of themselves. That's such an extraordinary thing. It's not something, the interesting thing to me is it's not something that obviously suggests itself when you look at the laws of physics. We like to marvel at things like black holes, but actually black holes are, once you sort of see the theory of general relativity, black holes are not mysterious. You can see that they ought to happen. They were predicted, but consciousness is not predicted by those fundamental laws, by general relativity or quantum mechanics. So I think I find something quite marvelous in that there is that depth of mystery that not only do we not quite know, we don't know the answers, but we don't really even understand the questions. So, I think it's quite possible that might turn out to be a problem that is fundamentally metaphysical, really, that we don't really know how to formulate as a scientific question. The same is true of why there is anything at all, why the universe exists. There are cosmologists who say, well, we can explain this using quantum field theory or something. And, I would say, well, then that's the problem. You can explain it using physical laws, but the question is about why there are physical laws, why there is anything at all. And I don't see any prospect that is something that can be turned into a scientific question. So I guess I feel it seems to me at the moment that there are going to be these ineffable mysteries to human existence that science can't fully account for.
This is interesting. So I don't know. I kind of got into this stream when I read Sarah Emery Walker's recent book on essentially the problem and the crises in physics. And one of the potential solutions to that one is one that I think a lot of scientists struggle to conceptualize or wrap their heads around, and that is the idea that consciousness is fundamental, that it's all essentially consciousness, and that what we understand as the material realm is the end of the line of that. At least that's how I understood the book. If I got it wrong, please correct me. It was a bit of a trip.
I'm really interested in Sarah's work, and I know about it, and I've had her book sitting in my stack for a long time, and I have to confess I haven't yet got round to reading the book itself, but I know of the work she's done, and it is extremely interesting. And that idea that maybe consciousness is fundamental maybe we have to, it's not going to come out of our theories of the physical world. It's actually, we've got to sort of find it as a fundamental axiom in some way. That is one that, some scientists like her, but also other philosophers are juggling with at the moment. And I'm agnostic about that idea, but I think it's an interesting possibility.
For you, what are the most interesting crises or question marks outstanding in science right now? We talked a little bit about consciousness, but are there other ones that just really you think are going to be stuff that we're chewing over collectively for a long time?
Yeah, well, ones that I think are going to prove more addressable, we have more prospect of getting to the bottom of. I guess two of them that spring out to me are the question of what quantum mechanics tells us about the fundamental nature of the world, and our prospects for understanding life, for understanding biology, and in particular life like us, complex life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both of those have made huge progress over the past sort of 2 or 3 decades. In quantum mechanics, because we can now do some experiments that used to just be thought experiments for the pioneers of quantum mechanics, Einstein and Niels Bohr and people like this. We can actually, start to think about doing experiments that might answer some of these questions. But there's something fundamentally strange about the nature of quantum mechanics as a theory, because it's a theory that doesn't seem to speak to what the world is like. It's a theory that seems to speak to our experience of it. The theory tells us what we can expect to see if we make measurements on a system, and the theory is silent about what is going on in the system before we make those measurements. And that's something that's very, very strange. It doesn't occur in any other scientific theory, and we don't know quite, how to make sense of that character of the theory. In biology, I think, in fact, my last book was sort of hubristically called How Life Works, and it was an attempt to explain the progress that's been made in biology, in fundamental biology, cell and molecular biology over the past 2 or 3 decades, that, in my view, has profoundly altered in some ways some of the fundamentals that we used to believe in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, the kinds of ideas that informed the Human Genome Project, and that we, now recognize are not as simple as that. It's certainly not as simple as saying that all life or all biology is explained as a kind of program that's encoded in our DNA, in our genomes, a sort of blueprint that is simply read out. That idea no longer works. And
oh, doesn't it? Have we? I missed the memo on why that no longer works. What are we at now?
It's because once we understand what really goes on in between our DNA and the whole organism, how the whole organism is related to its DNA. I'm not going to say arises from it, because it doesn't. It's how it relates to its DNA. Then that picture of a blueprint no longer becomes tenable. And there are all kinds of reasons why that is so. But it seems clear that there is no way of directly mapping from the information that's in our genes. In fact, we don't even quite know what genes are anymore, but the information that's in our genes, we can't directly map that onto the physical traits that we have, our appearance, our intelligence, the ways our bodies work. There are too many layers of complexity in between those two things, and the better way to think about it now is that there are flows of information up and down and sideways between all of those different levels of the hierarchy. And in some ways, it's better now, I think, to think of the genome as a resource that our cells, which are the smallest units that are actually alive, that our cells make use of in order to function and in order to sustain whole organisms.
But then what's driving the process?
Well, that's really the question. What is driving the process? Because
as you're speaking, I'm literally going, oh no, I don't.
Well, that's fine. This is how science progresses. You see, what is driving that process? I think one way to think about that question, that very good question, is that process has been going on since life began, perhaps as much as 4 billion years ago. There has been no break in living systems between when they first appeared, and that's a real mystery that again science may not answer. Partly, I think perhaps just because the evidence no longer is around, it's kind of it's been wiped since then.
The primordial soup is no longer around for us to study.
Exactly, and in fact, I think most scientists no longer believe it was a primordial soup. Anyway,
oh no,
yeah, I'm sorry.
We don't believe it's a primordial soup anymore.
I'm afraid so. I'm afraid the primordial soup is cooked. But since that, however that process began, life has continued as an unbroken thread from one generation to the next. We can trace it back unbroken back to the first primitive organism, an unbroken thread leading to us. And so it's the process of life that is what keeps that going. Life doesn't have to start and cannot start itself afresh every time a new organism comes into existence. Life continues to exist in those living cells from which we all grow and from which, which came from our biological parents and so on. So
it's an accretion of complexity. It's accretion of increasingly complex information over time as expressed through the organism.
There has been an increase in the complexity of some organisms. I mean, most life on Earth is in some ways as simple as it was, 3 billion years ago. It's single-celled. It's bacteria, but there weren't complex organisms like us around back then, and certainly there were the complexity of our cognitive processes is way above what existed, say, 1 million years ago. So there has been an increase in the complexity that is possible in organisms. I think that's probably the best way of saying it. Whether or not that's inevitable in the process of evolution is something that, again, scientists are still debating, whether it was just an accident and whether life could have just stayed bacterial, or whether it was inevitable that it would get more complex. That's a big area of debate at the moment. But regardless of whether that's the case, I think it makes more sense now to see the process of life as being the sort of fundamental thing rather than the existence of a strand of DNA. If you put that strand of DNA in a test tube, an entire human genome, you can throw at it all the other molecules, all the proteins and all the lipids and so on that it needs, but it's never going to create anything alive. It's never going to create a living cell. Life has to be there in the first place to do anything with DNA. And that's why I would put cells back at the center of the question.
Okay, so while we're taking my brain apart, because apparently everything that I learned in high school biology is wrong, what do we mean by the process of life, though? Because I understand that the life doesn't necessarily live in the material parts of the thing. It lives in the evolution and the movement itself.
Yes, it does. It lives in the dynamical process itself. You and I, the atoms in our bodies are almost entirely replaced from how they were, several years ago in our lives. Certainly, most of they weren't there when we were children. So there's something about that process of life that is not in the material that it's made from, in the same way that a rock has this, essentially the same atoms as it had, a billion years ago when it was formed. It's a dynamical process. There's this continual turnover of material. Something else is keeping us, as coherent organisms.
But it's not DNA.
And it's
what
not
is
DNA.
it?
The DNA itself has also been replaced. So it's what scientists call a non-equilibrium process. We're out of equilibrium. If we were in equilibrium, we would be dead. That's the definition of equilibrium. So that's why we're constantly having to take in energy to eat. Is
this why we're doomed to always be miserable?
I find it quite liberating, actually, to think of life this way. To think that what we are is some kind of self-organizing process that does stuff with matter. it's a kind of it seems to me that somehow the basis of life is more in that information, that pattern of information that is able to sustain itself, even though the actual matter, the physical matter, the atoms are just kind of coming through the system and going back out again. It's that pattern that is being sustained. So that's really what we need to understand life. How can it be that that pattern, that self-sustaining pattern of information remains stable despite this constant sort of through flux of matter itself? And that's in essence what that means is we need to understand life as a process rather than as a kind of crude physical readout of stuff that's encoded in our DNA.
This is a hell of a thing to be throwing at me only a few days after I came back from a very intense meditation retreat. I got to be honest with you. Next thing I'm going to ask you, so if the primordial soup thing is not right anymore, what are we working on now? What are scientists working on now, if not primordial soup as being the origin of life?
Well, there are a lot of theories. One of the ones that a lot of people are feel most positive about now, and that I certainly see a lot of attraction to, is that. So the primordial soup was this idea that somehow simple organic molecules like the amino acids that our proteins are made of formed in spontaneous chemical reactions on the early Earth, and we can make them from chemical reactions just involving non-living, non-lifelike compounds like methane and water. If you zap them with electricity, you can find that you can get simple amino acids. This was an experiment that was done back in 1953, and interestingly, the same year that we discovered the structure of DNA. But it's not at all clear how you can get from a sort of very, very dilute soup of molecules like that to anything that looks lifelike, that has this property of being a sort of self-sustaining chemical process. So a lot of people now think that life didn't happen at the surface of the oceans on our early planet with this sort of soup of simple molecules, but it happened deep down in the oceans at so-called hydrothermal vents, volcanic vents, where the heat of volcanism underneath the ocean crust, underneath the ocean surface, is driving hot water, hot fluids out from these systems. They're sort of chimney-like systems built from minerals called hydrothermal vents. So this hot water is coming through, and it's saturated with all sorts of minerals. And so there's a source of energy for that, which is, the key thing you want for getting life going. You need some kind of source of energy, but also the kinds of chemical processes that are going on there amongst the minerals and amongst the sort of carbon-rich material that you can find at these vents. They're the kind of processes that within which you can start to see the prospect for some kind of early metabolism going on, not in living systems, but in systems that are in a sort of limbo between being purely mineral-like and being lifelike. So you can see, and people can show that minerals like this can form very thin sort of membrane-type systems. And then once you have a membrane, once you have an inside and an outside, you can get gradients of chemical composition across them. So there's more a higher concentration of a chemical on one side than on the other. Once you have that, then you have a gradient that you can use, or that these systems could use, if we want to put it that anthropomorphically, use to sort of drive a kind of metabolic processes to start to create more complex organic chemicals. And you also have a membrane sort of ready-made that could maybe bud off into something that looks a little bit like a cell. So this is basically the idea of life having begun at these deep sea hydrothermal vents. So you have a source of energy that isn't the sun; it's volcanic energy. You have a system that can give rise to gradients in chemical concentration, and that's absolutely what you need for life. That's where the non-equilibrium comes from. If you've got a gradient, then it's not in equilibrium, and so you have the chemical components, carbon and sulfur and and phosphorus and things that life needs. So you seem to have all the components for having a sort of proto-living system. And people are, and this is also something that you can study experimentally in the lab. You can start to build analogs of these systems in the lab and see what they can come up with. So it's a very rich area of research at the moment to, to see whether we can create some kind of plausible story for how something lifelike may have begun.
Fantastic. Okay, next thing you're going to tell me that we're rethinking the Big Bang.
Yes, we are.
No, no.
We really are.
Oh,
I mean,
no.
the conventional story for the Big Bang. I mean, and as I say, we don't know how it began, but we the idea was that however it began, whether it was some sort of random fluctuation in this sort of quantum background. That the standard idea is that very soon after that beginning, there was a period of something called inflation, where the universe went from being smaller than a subatomic particle to being, cosmic in size. And we don't know what would have driven this period of inflation, but there are a lot of observations in cosmology now that it seems to explain. In particular, whatever theory we have for the Big Bang, it has to explain the structure of what's called the cosmic microwave background, which is basically the sort of background buzz left over from this incredibly energetic process. So now that buzz is just, when the Big Bang happened, the temperatures are too big to even be meaningful. But now the background temperature of the universe is about 2.7 degrees above absolute zero. And it seems to be very uniform across the whole observable universe, but there are small patches where it differs very, very slightly, and so we have to explain both why it's so uniform everywhere, but also the pattern of these little fluctuations in temperature that we see. That's something that theories of inflation seem to be able to explain, but the problem is that there are actually too many ways of getting something like inflation. The favorite way of doing that is to use string theory, which suggests that at the finest level, that the universe isn't made up of particles. It's made up of these tiny little things called strings, which are they're a bit like sort of stretched out particles. The problem is that it makes sense mathematically, but it gives rise to a ridiculous number of possible theories or possible solutions, and we have no way of choosing between those. So there are questions that this standard idea of inflationary Big Bang doesn't yet quite answer. And so people have come up with, again, a ridiculous number of possible alternatives. Some cosmologists think that instead of there being a Big Bang at which everything began, there was perhaps a cyclic process where there are a whole series of Big Bangs and universes that expand and then shrink again. One of the standard predictions of inflationary theory is that there wasn't just a single Big Bang, they're happening all the time. And inflation is happening all the time. And we're just one universe amongst the many that are being produced. There are ideas that look kind of symmetric in time. So if we sort of extrapolate back to the Big Bang, it's a bit like an hourglass. We can go beyond that and we see a universe opening up again. So there are all kinds of different universes that have been suggested. There's one that completely, and this is an idea from Roger Penrose, who's a Nobel laureate physicist and one of the most brilliant physicists still living, and Roger is still living at 90 plus years. And he has come up with this idea that actually, if the universe is expanding, and so everything is getting further apart, and you could say space is getting more and more sort of rarefied, and eventually you get to this place where there's almost sort of nothing there. But somehow in this idea, a little bit of that really, really stretched out space looks like a Big Bang again. And so somehow you can
Oh,
sort of convert
that's
that
just going
space
to
into
break
an
my
music.
brain now. Like,
I know
so everything's like a Fibonacci sequence
it
forever.
sort of is. It is a bit like that. Yeah, that mathematically, again, this can make sense. So there are so many ways of theorizing about how the universe may have begun, if indeed it began at all. Or, maybe there was this sort of cyclic series of universes going back forever.
So, I mean, what I'm hearing here is that psilocybin is the answer to the mysteries of the universe. And that after all this time, the best thing that we know is that we still know nothing.
We know. I would like to sort of see it as we have a better idea of where our ignorance lies. That in a way is the best thing that science can do. It can show you what you don't know. So there's an awful lot that we do understand now. We do know that, for example, quantum mechanics is a better way of thinking about the world at the atomic scale than the classical physics that was around before that and that came from Isaac Newton gave us. We know an awful lot about the way our bodies work that we didn't know 100 years ago. So we do make progress, but every time we do that, I mean, and Newton had a phrase about this as well. It was, I forget quite how he put it, but it's basically, he had this sort of image of standing on the edge of this sort of infinite sea. And, as we come to understand something, new vistas of ignorance sort of open up. And,
like a Fibonacci sequence.
It kind of is, but in a sense, that's what scientists want. I think people have this idea that scientists want to explain everything, and sometimes they give the impression that they want to explain everything and that, science is just going to, put an end to every mystery. But actually what scientists want is new questions. And, every time we do have a better explanation for something or other, it tends to pose another 10 questions about things that, not only do we not know the answers to, but we didn't even know were questions before. And that's the wonderful thing about what science does.
So that's trippy as heck. What I think is an interesting question to ground this back a little bit back into where most people live most of their lives is, how do we reconcile the fact that our understanding of who and what we are and what's going around us is constantly changing through scientific inquiry, and say, well, that lives in the realm of ordinary curiosity and evolution of knowledge and fact. And how do we reconcile that with the rise of anti-science, or the rise of the idea that nothing that comes out of any kind of scientific inquiry right now can be trusted because the institutions are failing, people are lying, there's too much profit or greed happening to driving the inquiries into the types of things we're looking for. We can't trust anything that anybody's telling us anymore. Like, how do we bridge that gap for people?
Yeah. It's a difficult one, and it's becoming increasingly difficult. But I think it's probably good also to keep some context on it, because what we tend to find when people don't trust science is it's very selective. That
Right.
People who don't trust evolutionary theory for religious reasons or for whatever reason, they'll be perfectly happy to, look up disproofs of evolutionary theory on their smartphone. They'll trust
Right.
the technologies behind, that they use in their daily lives. They'll get on
or they'll ask the AI that they know is programmed in order to basically feed them back the version of events that they're looking to hear.
Well, that's
and they'll do that
worse.
do that with total doe-eyed naivete.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And that's really the problem. That that's one of the problems that AI is making worse. But I tend to sort of see it as, it's not a distrust necessarily of everything in science. It's this very selective distrust that then gives us something to try to understand. What is it about particular aspects of science that people distrust? So if people distrust, as of course many people are being encouraged to do nowadays, if they distrust vaccines, for example, what is that distrust rooted in? Most people, I think, who distrust vaccines will probably be very happy to take all kinds of prescription medicines that have been tested in exactly the same way the vaccines have. There is something about the notion of vaccines, or even particular types of vaccine, that are now being sort of discredited by sources of misinformation. So we need to understand where those fears come from. And, I think one thing that's clear is that wherever they come from, they're not going to be dispelled by simply throwing more science at people, or by simply pointing at graphs, however convincing those graphs are. The graph that showed the efficacy of the COVID vaccine, it's one of the most convincing vaccination graphs you've ever seen when you look at what happened in the control group and the group of people that had the vaccines. And if you look at the graphs of the safety data, it's very, very clear that there aren't problems there. But that isn't going to be what makes a difference to
no, because I can literally hear my comment section barking at me right now, saying, "Jen, start challenging him on this to point out that that the vaccine didn't reduce transmission as much as was promised, or that it wasn't tested as highly, or that it wasn't or that young men have a higher myocardial infarction rate than other types of I can literally hear the chorus in the back of my comment section going into this, and I think that it's really tempting to get caught into a point by point debate on facts. I think the crucial point that you've pointed out, and I think is the correct one, is that we have to get to the emotional reasons why people are latching on to data that confirms their priors on this sort of stuff. So what is the emotional reason why people are terrified, particularly of the COVID vaccine? What is it that they think is going on that is leading to that? And the answers that you inevitably get are fundamentally questions of distrust in institutions, distrust of the pharmacology industry, distrust of the kind of governments that are pushing this on people, fear of death. I think that you have a lot of unresolved trauma from just what we went through during COVID and the lockdowns and the impacts of all of that are feeding a lot of that as well. So I don't know how you address that through science. I think that requires a more deft emotional touch, if that makes sense.
Well, I think you can start to address it through social science, certainly, using techniques of social science to understand what is driving this. And I think one very clear message that has come across already is that it would be a mistake to suppose that it's always the same thing, that the reasons for vaccine hesitancy are very different amongst very different demographics, amongst different countries, and sometimes the reasoning has some validity, not in the sense that the vaccines don't work or that they're dangerous, but that there is validity in, having some concerns about the way the pharmaceutical industry has operated and the profit motives that exist. In African countries, in some African countries, there is a strong distrust of official messages for very good reason, in some cases, and there's also some concern about the way that Western medicines have been used or not used in African countries, and about some of the historical problems that have arisen in the way vaccines and drugs were tested. So it's important to recognize that even if some of those concerns don't apply to the vaccines themselves, that there are some grounds for them. In Western countries and Western industrialized countries, some of the reasons for vaccine hesitancy has come from the concern that vaccines have been linked to things like autism. There have been many studies showing that there is no such link whatsoever. There is no good evidence for such a link, but it's really important to recognize the depths of that concern, that that you're asking someone to put into their child or their baby, even sometimes, something that if the fear is there that it could do them harm, and that you have made the choice to have that done. It's totally understandable that's such a deep worry that once it's there, it's very hard to dispel with however much data you use. It's possible to do that, and it's important that the attempt is made, but it's also important to recognize that those concerns are, at some level, they're not irrational. Of course, it's not irrational to be worried about whether there might be potential side effects of something that you're going to give your child.
I think this goes back to your original point about the necessity for science critics, because people don't build trust in institutions and processes solely through those institutions and processes pumping out data, reliable, usable data. Part of the process of building trust in institutions is making sure that those people feel as if those institutions have a couple of watchers at the gate, so to speak, people watching to make sure that moralities are respected, people's emotions are being respected, people and their dignity is being respected as well. And I think that even as you said that, I had a light bulb moment, because I'm like, there aren't actually, when we read about Canadian politics, for example, we understand that part of what makes systems and governments better and more functional is an open, frankly vicious press to go after people when they screw up. That's part of what builds democratic trust in institutions. But there isn't the equivalent. I'm sure there are science critics out there, but there isn't that equivalent idea in scientific institutions. There's not this idea that there is a press corps of rabid journalists out there looking to tear apart every. I mean, you guys have the peer review process, but it's not quite the same thing. It's not like you guys have a press corps of absolutely rabid journalists who are just chomping at the bit to get the gotcha moment to tear your paper apart the second you announce it. And I wonder if that is a constructive adversarial process, more of a constructive adversarial process, people to do that job on behalf of ordinary people as opposed to fellow academics. I wonder if that is something that needs to be seriously considered as part of the scientific process.
Well, I absolutely think it's something that needs to be recognized as being essential to the scientific process. That, there are times when scientists seem to have the impression that science journalists and science writers, science communicators are there to do their publicity for them, right. To wave the flag for them. Now, there are times when it's really important to do that, or when it's really important to help get the scientific message across. I mean, coming back to vaccines again, the moment we knew that the COVID vaccines worked and that they were going to be rolled out very quickly, I felt it to be incredibly urgent to explain to people how it could be that they were developed so fast. Because it was absolutely understandable that people would be saying, hang on a minute, how do we know they're safe? We were told most vaccines take 10 years to develop. There were answers to those questions. There were good answers to those questions, but people needed to be told about them. They couldn't, just be expected to take it on trust. But at the same time, I mean, COVID exposed the whole complexity of this system. That a fair part of what I found myself doing was really critiquing the process by which science was fed into policy making and the interactions between those two things, because it seemed to me that the whole crisis, the whole pandemic crisis, exposed some of the difficulties and problems and weaknesses in that process, which happened in different ways in different countries because they have different processes. And I was particularly focused on the UK, but there were some common problems that many countries faced in that interaction. How politicians would make use of science and sometimes perhaps make a misuse of science, and how sometimes scientists weren't being sufficiently outspoken or sufficiently careful in what they were saying to politicians. So, it felt to me like, there were a lot of things there to be unpacked, which weren't about going after the science and the science.
But people build faith in institutions, ironically, when they see those institutions be meaningfully challenged.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Institutions, meaning academic institutions,
scientific institutions,
and the industry, behind this. So it was absolutely, essential to do that. And it was also essential because scientists themselves were understandably saying different things about
Right.
how far the pandemic had spread, what the effects were, what were effective treatments, because knowledge was changing. And
Right.
so, it was our job to try to make some kind of sense and to try to inject appropriate caution into things that sometimes scientists were saying without that. So yeah, it really highlighted to me that how essential it was to have people who were going to be critical in the proper sense of the scientific process, to try to give people the sort of context that would help them to, make sense of what was going on.
Philip, I've so enjoyed our conversation that I'm afraid that we haven't even begun to talk about your recent book on alchemy. Would you mind if I put a break here, just tell people to like and subscribe to Line, and we can come back to alchemy? Is that all right? Or do you have a few more minutes? Is that okay? All right.
Sure.
Well, check us out, www.readtheline.ca. Like and subscribe if you like this kind of chat. Also, send us a note. Make sure that you give us your feedback. Preferably your positive feedback, but I'll skim read some of the negative stuff too. And join us after the break.
This episode of On the Line is also brought to you by the Daily Bread Food Bank. Imagine choosing between food, rent, or medicine. For the 1.5 million Canadians with disabilities living in poverty, that is the daily reality. The Canada Disability Benefit was created to help, but at less than $7 a day, it isn't enough. Daily Bread Food Bank and coalition partners are urging government to fully fund the benefit. Visit fundthebenefit.ca to take action. Together, we can ensure every Canadian with a disability has the dignity of food and security.
Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen of On the Line. Today we have with us science writer Philip Ball. We just chatted for about an hour about everything that science does and doesn't know about everything in the universe, and I've been delighted. That's exactly the kind of conversation I love having here on the Line. But I did promise we were going to talk about your most recent book, Mr. Ball. Can you give us a sense of what in the world you are publishing about now and why I found it so interesting?
Well, this is a book on the history of alchemy. It's an illustrated history of alchemy, and that was really what enticed me to do it, because alchemy, as well as being a fascinating subject in its own right, it is so full of amazing imagery. And that was actually a part of, maybe we'll talk about this as an intrinsic part of the communication of alchemical knowledge was in the imagery. So the book is absolutely full of these, color images of alchemical processes and people and allegories throughout time. So it looks wonderful, and I can say that without praising myself, because I wasn't responsible for producing and putting this book together. I just wrote the words, but it's the thing that drew me to it. I've always had an interest in alchemy, because it seems to me to speak to a time when, it certainly speaks to a time when science, it was before science was called that. It would have been called natural philosophy. Mm-hmm. And it spoke to a time when it could speak more widely to human experience than it does today. That for some people, alchemy was about making stuff, and this is something that's often overlooked in the history of science. We think of it as a series of ideas, but actually it's also about technology. Science has always been about making stuff, and this is what alchemists did. They didn't just try to make gold; they made dyes, they made pigments, they made cosmetics, they made soaps, they made metals. All of this was, to people certainly in the Middle Ages and up to the Renaissance, really was just what alchemy did. If you were a painter and you wanted to get your pigments, you would go to the alchemists to get them. So there was that aspect to it, but also there was a kind of what even then would have been thought of as a mystical strand to alchemy. It was telling us, it seemed, something about the philosophy and the nature of the whole cosmos. And we find again and again in alchemy, particularly from the Middle Ages through to Renaissance, we find the idea. Well, it's really expressed in one of the key texts of alchemy that sort of goes back to early times, goes back to about the 3rd century AD. There was a text that said that alchemy, the essence of alchemy was the idea of as above, so below. What happens in the sky, in the celestial context, in the broader cosmos, is reflected in what happens in sort of little systems on Earth. And that idea sort of gave rise to the notion that alchemists in the laboratory could see in their flasks and in their mixtures of chemicals things that were actually sort of they were like a microcosm of what was going on in the macrocosm. If you somehow carried out a process that seemed to be transforming metals in your flask, well, that was just what people believed happened in nature, in the deep earth. The metals were transformed one to another. If you saw processes of evaporation and condensation of liquids in your flask, that was no different to what happened when waters evaporate from the earth and fall back down as rain. And so from the study of these chemical processes in the laboratory, you could start to build up a kind of a theory of everything, a picture of the whole cosmos. So it was in these kinds of senses, it was a wonderfully imaginative sort of pre-scientific way of doing natural philosophy.
This is fascinating because this gets us also to a time when there really isn't a division between religion and science. Like the act of science is one of also finding out the nature of the cosmos and of God.
Yes, well, there were some alchemists who believed that the kind of purification that they were trying to carry out in their flasks, in particular to try to purify base metals like lead, as they would see it, purify them and refine them to the state of gold, which was the purest of metals, that this was a kind of an allegory for the purification of the Christian soul, and there were all kinds of allegories about the transformations that were going on in flasks being related to the transformation that Christ underwent on the cross. So there were, and these weren't just kind of vague comparisons or analogies. They were allegories or correspondences in the sense that there was a very deep connection between them. And in the same way as it was understood that there were deep connections between or correspondences between certain sorts of metal and certain sorts of plant and the planets. So that each different metal, as they were known then, we know many more metals now than we did then. But each metal that was known back then in the Middle Ages, say, had a corresponding planet. So copper corresponded to Venus, silver corresponded to the moon, and so forth. And gold, of course, corresponded to the sun. And these correspondences were something that they were a kind of a pattern that God had ingrained in nature. So there were clues within nature, within the nature of plants and within the nature of metals in particular, that clues about the way God had constructed the universe. And so for some alchemists, the task was to understand those clues that existed in nature so as to better understand the way God had created the whole cosmos.
Okay, so this is really interesting because we go from this pre-scientific concept of exploration where the idea of, exploring the nature of the universe around you and trying to get a handle on it through early chemical experiments isn't really distinct from a religious process. Then we move into this more what's quote unquote scientific thought where we start to create these hard lines between that's religion and spirituality. This is science. These are different things. We're doing different processes. And yet we seem to have reached kind of a process where we're almost creating a reintegration of that, where now we're going back to this idea where we're using the scientific method to have a much better understanding of cosmology. So we're getting back to science to understand the nature of God. We just don't call it that. We call it something else now. It seems like there's a bit of a process that's happening here, which I think is fascinating.
There are certainly analogies that you could draw between the two, because there were certainly alchemists in the 15th, 16th century who had a kind of cosmology that was a chemical cosmology. They would talk about it as the chemical philosophy. And as I say, it was a chemical way of understanding the whole process of creation. So we could see, that we could see an analogy between that and the way we try now to use physical theories to understand cosmology, to understand the whole universe. Right. But I think the most of the physicists and the cosmologists and the astrophysicists who are using those theories, I mean, they tend
they'd be horrified by my statement, wouldn't they? Yes, no, that's just fine. That just tells me that they're not reconciled yet. That's not a problem for me.
It's I guess that what they would say is there is no obvious need of a creator or a higher purpose or a prime mover in any of that, because the physical theories themselves can do that work, and that's really the process that has been underway ever since the so-called scientific revolution in the 17th century. That sort of and clearly Darwin's theory of evolution was part of that. It becomes a kind of a naturalization of what previously was considered to be God's work. But I think that we have to
wait a minute, unless consciousness is fundamental, in which case we're not trying to prove the God of the 14th century here. We're coming back to a much more cohesive and holistic understanding of God that is very different from what our ancestors would have understood. But that is what one would expect after going through a separation and reconciliation process, isn't it?
Well, I think that there are people who would see it that way, but I think that there are also people who would, I think, quite rightly argue that that isn't so different from the way some of the deepest religious thinkers, some of the most profound theologians in the Middle Ages and before thought about God. This idea of God as a kind of creator, a sort of workman, really, who was, fabricating the universe in his workshop. This is not the way that people like St. Augustine thought about God. And it's, this is why I find it always very dispiriting when people say, well, cosmology has gotten rid of, the need for the divine creation of the universe, as though the idea, that we're trying to get rid of is of this God sort of standing around tinkering with the universe and putting it together. That was really never the idea at the core of certainly the Christian faith, but I think also of most ideas of God or of a divine creation. It wasn't that sort of crude fabrication in a workshop. So I guess I feel that the way we've talked about the interaction between science and religion in terms of cosmology in modern times, it really doesn't do credit to the kinds of ways that God was thought about, even in sort of the times of the early Christian fathers. We have to have a more sophisticated conversation about what that God was really about. And I think, there are people who very reasonably argue that notion of a God was really the notion of, again, coming back to this idea of why there is something rather than nothing. That is that's really the function that God had, to make something rather than nothing, not to make it in a crude sense of putting atoms together, but to create the whole notion of existence.
Marvelous. And also, further to that point, I think that something that a lot of modern people get hung up on is mistaking metaphor for reality in the past. So they're critiquing their ancestors' metaphor for God, as opposed to actually critiquing their ancestors' real understanding and experience of that phenomena, right?
I think that's right. I mean, I think, one has to say that metaphorical use of God is often the one that fundamentalist religions latch onto now. That's really the problem, that fundamentalist religions of all sorts are often rooted in extremely poor theology.
Yeah, that's right. Um, is there anything else that I'm forgetting to ask you? I've been delighted by this conversation. Everything we've talked about is so up my alley. I'm completely engaged. I could talk to you for another hour very simply. Is there anything else that you wanted to bring up, or is there any other question that I'm forgetting to ask?
Goodness, I mean, there's there's plenty else that we could talk about. I mean, I could talk endlessly about quantum mechanics, but won't because I
Okay.
feel
Okay.
that
Well, that's we'd probably go on too long if we really get into quantum mechanics. But you know what? I would love to have you on again to talk about quantum mechanics if you're into it. That would be really fun for me. So
well, fine. I'm always happy to talk on that subject. Yeah.
excellent. Well, thank you so much, Philip. I really appreciate your time. Now, what is the name of your book, and where can we get it?
So yeah, I have to check the subtitle here because it's a long one. It's simply called Alchemy, and the subtitle is An Illustrated History of Elixirs, Experiments, and the Birth of Modern Science. And it's
Here,
published
can you hold it up for me?
yeah, here we
Oh,
are.
oh, that's a beautiful book. That's
And
pretty.
it's published by Yale University Press. And I mean, yeah, it really is. If you can,
Oh gosh, it's so pretty. There are pictures. I love it when the books have pictures. That's fantastic for me. All right. Well, thank you again so much for your time. And once again, do check us out, www.readtheline.ca. Philip, is there any place that people can reach you if they want to reach you?
you can get me via my website, www.philipball.co.uk.
Okay, and excellent. And if you are listening to us on our podcast, do check out the book because it's really pretty. I love a pretty book. And again, thanks for staying with us and chatting with us on the Line.